good evening, morning, afternoon, or whatever time it may be for you. You are about to listen to a Royal Mirror audio story. The audio will be accompanied with visuals to enhance the experience. However, if you prefer to simply listen, they aren't necessary. If you'd like to follow along, or would simply prefer to read the story, you can find a link to the text in the description below. I hope you enjoy. Now, on to our tale. War. Another reality. The Vortex of New Valois. Part 4. Liam let out a long, pained sigh as he relaxed against a fallen piece of concrete. The place where it had been broken off was clearly visible on one of the above buildings. Between being shot at by an enforcer droid and the confrontation with Silas, it had easily been the most stressful day in the paramedic's life, and it had plenty of competition. Yet, the day still wasn't over. He and Voodoo still had to make the last leg of the trek to the laboratory through the dangers of New Valois. The paramedic turned his head to look up morosely at the night. "We're both medical professionals. Healers, if you want to be a bit more wistful about it." Liam took a moment to swallow before finishing his question. "So, how do you kill people, Voodoo?" The knight raised his eyebrows in surprise, not yet knowing how to respond to such a direct question. The paramedic continued before a response could be mustered. It's not a judgment, given what happened. I just really need to know how you do it." Voodoo remained silent for a few moments more, trying to think of an appropriate response. He wanted Liam to be ready to make the last leg of their journey, and didn't want to say anything that would emotionally compromise him before they got to the lab. His eyes drifted down from Liam towards the vitals monitor on the scavenger, still blinking green as a sign of life. The knight settled on an easy, non-answer. "You haven't killed anyone, Liam," he stated simply. The paramedic's eyes narrowed, and he folded his arms. "Come on, Voodoo. I know you don't think that matters," he explained, nodding back towards the unconscious man on the ground. "I meant to kill him. Everyone in the Republic has seen enough anointed scripture to know that that's all it takes in your eyes." Liam lowered his head. "I can get behind that part at least. I made the decision. I pulled the trigger. His survival was up to chance." Voodoo scratched his chin and slowly turned his head towards Liam, pondering his next move. Eventually he gave a nod, conceding the point. "All right, that's fair. You know your stuff," Voodoo responded. The knight felt some satisfaction that the paramedic was beginning to understand him well enough to know what could make him talk. There was another moment of silence as Voodoo stalled for time, but Liam wasn't keen on waiting. "So, tell me, how do you do it?" the paramedic asked more insistently. Voodoo felt a broad smile spread across his face, and he locked eyes with Liam. "Well, maybe I'm just a bad guy." The smile didn't leave the knight's face, but the paramedic's eyes narrowed, and he scoffed in annoyance as he folded his arms across his chest. "That's not going to cut it, Voodoo." A few more moments of silence fell over the street of that ruined city. Then there was a subtle nod of the now uncovered blonde head, and the knight began. "Being, healers, as you called us, I believe our purpose is to bring people back to health." Voodoo spoke levelly, softly, as he continued. "To me, that means examining people's biology and ensuring it fulfills its purpose. It might seem antithetical for a healer to destroy, but in fact, we do it all the time. Voodoo paused for a moment, stroking his chin as he thought of an example. Then he had it. A kidney's purpose is to remove toxins from the body. We can use blood tests to determine whether or not it is fulfilling this purpose properly. We can diagnose problems with it and perform procedures on it to return it to working order. Voodoo's face darkened slightly, as did his tone as he proceeded with the remainder of the explanation. Sometimes, a kidney can do the opposite of what it was intended to do. If it becomes cancerous, it can spread dangerous impurities throughout the body, instead of cleansing them. Sometimes an organ can be so far gone, it can't possibly be returned to performing its original function. And in those circumstances, the healthiest thing to do could be to remove it entirely. Liam raised an eyebrow at this explanation by the knight. He thought he knew where the conversation was headed, and he didn't like it. Pushing himself off of the rubble, he stepped in to clarify what Voodoo meant by his metaphor. You think Silas wasn't fulfilling his purpose to society? That he was too far gone and needed to be cut out because he was too dangerous to the well-being of others? The knight shook his head. No, I don't think it is our place to decide whether or not the health of our friend here or the health of the rest of the citizens of New Valois is more important. Voodoo eased himself off of the rubble and walked over to the injured bandit. He knelt down beside Silas, a piece of broken glass cracking under the weight of his heavy pollain, before looking back towards the paramedic. I believe our scavenger's decision to kill his fellow man with a railgun-armed enforcement droid for his own self-centered gain was more dangerous to his own well-being than it was to others. There was a short break in the conversation, filled only by the sound of the heavy wind and Liam's boots plodding over to the scavenger as he moved to stand across from Voodoo. Then the paramedic resumed his questioning. More dangerous to his well-being than a bullet to the chest? He asked, the skepticism obvious in his tone. The knight responded earnestly, nonetheless. Maybe. I don't know. Voodoo let out a sigh and looked up past the paramedic into the swirling gray miasma of a sky above them. There's a lot of things I thought I knew that I'm not so sure about these days. All I can tell you is that if I had to pick between being a murderer and the bullet in the chest, I hope I'd pick the bullet. There was a certain logic to it that Liam understood. He had always figured it was better to be harmed than to harm. Still, the conversation had done nothing to calm his racing thoughts. Silence descended over the ruined road for a few more moments as Voodoo's eyes glanced back down towards the scavenger. Without his helmet interface, he needed to do a little poking and prodding to assess the condition of the wounded. Finally, he gave a short nod. He's ready to move. The knight grabbed one of the man's arms and one of his legs and rolled the scavenger onto his shoulders into a fireman's carry. Voodoo stood, hefted the scavenger onto his back, and secured him with one arm. A quick gesture by the paramedic made the path to the laboratory flicker back into the AR display layered over his eye. He and the knight locked eyes for a brief moment, and with each of them seeing that the other was ready, they started moving again. After a few more mercifully uneventful hours of travel, the massive metal quarantine gate of the lab stood before the trio. It seemed the final researchers at the lab had managed to trigger the Leviticus protocols before evacuating, creating an airtight seal of thick metal around the entire facility. Neither scavengers nor the natural devastation of the storm had pierced through it. At least not yet. Liam clutched his credentials card for the lab in one hand and looked at the quarantine wall with a grimace. Usually I just show my ID at the front desk. Never had to deal with the front desk being locked behind an impenetrable wall before. Voodoo held out his hand for the card, and Liam passed it over to him readily. The knight's eyes darted up and down the quarantine wall. No wall is impenetrable, Liam, Voodoo stated confidently, as he glanced down at the credential card. We might be able to connect to their network using your credentials from out here. The symbols, representing the sophisticated encryption of Liam's credentials on the card, flashed blue as the knight's AR display scanned them into his chip. Hildy, what do you think? Can you get us in? Liam looked over as the knight scanned the card. We're not supposed to share our credentials over open comms, but given the... There was a heavy screech of metal on metal as the heavy, rarely used machinery roared to life within the gate. The paramedic clamped his hands over his ears and gritted his teeth as the din of the opening sequence echoed through the dilapidated and disaster-stricken alleys of New Valois. Liam felt a rush of air over his skin and heard a hiss as the pressure inside the airtight facility equalized with the rest of the atmosphere. As the magnetic clamps released, the motors engaged, and the doors slid against the concrete of the street as the quarantine gate fully retracted, kicking up dust and debris and rattling Liam's jaw. There was one final clang as the doors locked into the open position, revealing an untarnished entryway with automatic sliding glass doors and a deceptively normal-looking office foyer. To Liam, it almost looked like a version of his hospital that had escaped the devastation of both the storm and the newfound destructive habits of a subsection of New Valois' population. Liam whipped his head around and gave the knight a withering scowl. Voodoo responded with an almost imperceptible shrug, careful not to shift the weight of the injured man still hefted on his shoulders. The thought to ask the knight for a warning the next time he was going to do something impulsive crossed Liam's mind, but he figured it would be pointless. They entered the lab together. Everything they saw was shockingly well preserved, looking no different from when Liam had been here before the catastrophe. Voodoo looked at his own augmented reality display again and flicked through a few screens. Perfect. Looks like auxiliary power is in good shape. Another gesture, and the lights in the foyer they had just entered came to life. Voodoo turned to look at Liam. To preserve the facility, I think it's best if I seal us back in. Liam had seen enough of the dangers outside, both natural and manufactured by man, to know that was for the best. The paramedic nodded his affirmation. A few more gestures on the knight's augmented reality display, a screeching of metal and machinery, the hiss of artificial air filling the facility, and it was sealed once more. The time Liam and the knight had spent together at the disease laboratory was fast approaching 72 hours. Although, to say they were spending the time together was a bit inaccurate. Liam had spent all of his time taking care of Silas, pacing, or scrounging for what snacks and other food he could find in the various rest and relaxation areas around the facility. Voodoo, on the other hand, had stayed completely cooped up in one of the many testing areas of the lab. As Liam sat beside the automated treatment bed, taking care of the injured scavenger's injuries and needs, his gaze wandered up to the man's stable vital signs and then down to the cuffs the knight had used to secure the man to the bed. The automated treatment regimen kept the scavenger sedated, but Voodoo wasn't taking any chances, and at this point, Liam wasn't inclined to protest the knight's forceful proclivities. with the bed keeping Silas alive, and the cuffs keeping him from running away, or worse. Liam figured there would be no harm in checking in on his armored friend. The lab was a labyrinth. The windows were locked down, so it was hard to tell the rooms apart from one another without any view of the city outside. There was an eerie quiet throughout the facility that accentuated the feeling of loneliness Liam had gnawing at him since this catastrophe had begun. Of course, there were precious few people to be met outside on the streets of New Valois, and fewer still who weren't actively out to better their own position at the expense of another's. However, the storm and the sounds of the decaying city had drowned out the disturbing silence that was so plainly on display in the lab. Liam realized that he'd grown used to the idea of having a warrior like Voodoo around. He would have balked at the idea of spending time with someone like the knight before the tether had fallen. But now, he felt his pace quicken as he made his way through the halls towards his companion. The paramedic had to poke his head into the doors of a few empty rooms, but finally, he found a room bathed in pale blue light emanating from a bank of computer screens. He immediately saw the outline of the knight seated in a steel chair with impressive structural integrity in front of the mass of screens. As Liam approached, he saw that Voodoo's eyes were closed. The man seemed to be asleep. Voodoo, are you awake?" the paramedic asked, remembering the last time he thought he'd managed to sneak up on the sleeping knight, only to be proven wrong. The blond man's eyes blinked open and fixated on the paramedic, a small smile crossing his face. "Greetings, Liam. I certainly was not a few moments ago, but now I'm quite awake," he teased, rubbing his face as he became more alert. The paramedic raised a brow. "I thought you had been working on a cure for the affliction this whole time." The subtle accusation drew a smirk and a chuckle out of the knight. "And I am," he said, and then, with a gesture towards the screen. "Or, at least, Hildy is." Liam glanced at the screen and saw a series of biological and chemical readouts and diagrams, which he vaguely recognized from his formal education. He didn't have enough practical experience with them to actually understand what they meant. "So, how is it coming along then?" Liam asked, leaning in over Voodoo's shoulder, pretending to focus intently on the incomprehensible symbology plastered across every single one of Voodoo's flickering screens. The warrior replied with a quick nod. "It's coming along very well," he said with satisfaction. "Hildy's been running evolutionary algorithms on the treatment. She's been making slight, semi-randomized adjustments to the chemical and biological makeup of the cure, simulating how that will interact with both the affliction and an average human body. Then she makes more adjustments and so on." Voodoo reached to the right of the computer terminal and brushed his gauntlet over a glass panel. Looking through it, the paramedic saw a plastic container filled with an unknown fluid. The knight continued. "The lab's specimens were critical in collecting the data we needed to run the algorithm. They'll also be necessary for physical tests of the treatment. Speaking of, you're actually just about in time for our next test." The knight pointed at one piece of symbology on his center screen that Liam immediately recognized. A progress bar. Both of them looked intently at the black outline, gradually filling up with a green rectangle. Only a fraction of the bar remained incomplete, and the rectangle expanded at a slow but steady pace. "Hildy should be finished evaluating the latest generation of the evolutionary algorithm right about now." Liam looked at the screen. The green bar was frozen in place, with barely a sliver of open space left. Voodoo let out a grumble. "My friends in communion may one day brew an elixir of life. but I doubt they, or any other mortal man, will ever be able to create an accurate progress bar. He sighed and lowered his arm, staring at the screen for a few more moments before it emitted a satisfying ding. The progress bar disappeared, and a message from Hildy popped up on screen. It read, Generation 9746 completed testing. Quit your whining, Voodoo. You can't rush art. The knight let out a snort. You're a soulless automaton, Hildy. You don't do art. He slid forward in his chair and got back on the terminal's controls. A couple of keystrokes here, a few button presses there. Then the knight was leaning over to peer through the glass panel at the physical specimen. Alright, begin experiment Affliction Alpha with the latest treatment generation in... Voodoo reached up and brushed the dust off of a nameplate above the glass panel. Test Chamber 0451. Another happy ding was emitted from the computer, and Liam leaned in towards the glass panel to watch. The automated test chambers were an impressive piece of work. 2 mechanical armatures that looked nothing like a human's could be programmed to do essentially any physical work for an experiment that a researcher could, except with more precision and without ever getting tired. In this case, the Experiment Affliction Alpha program, presumably written by Voodoo, made one of the armatures grip a syringe and pressed it into a tube. The other limb gently pulled back the plunger rod and the syringe filled with a light blue fluid. The tip was then removed from the tub and placed just above the specimen container. The plunger rod was pushed down and several drops of the blue fluid dripped onto the specimen. The mechanical armatures placed the syringe down and were still. Liam waited, patiently at first, but as the seconds turned to minutes, he found his vision darting between the test chamber and Voodoo more frequently. Is something supposed to happen? In response, the knight merely held up a finger, indicating the paramedic should wait longer. Like Hildy informed us, Liam, you can't rush art. The finger remained held up, and Liam glared at it. He had thought that knights received mandatory etiquette training. Perhaps Voodoo had missed it. Liam folded his arms and raised a brow. I thought you said machines were soulless automatons who couldn't do art. A short snicker slipped from the knight's lips, and he gestured at the mechanical armatures. The armatures aren't doing the art. You're watching the art of a program I wrote. It was obvious from the look on Voodoo's face that the knight was teasing the paramedic, but Liam wanted to get in the last word. However, before he could come up with something, the mechanical whir of the armature started once more. This time, only one of the machines moved to grab some sort of testing rod, which the machine slipped into the mixture of fluids in the test chamber. A few moments passed, and then a purple light started to glow from the handle of the rod. Voodoo smiled, and Liam caught it out of the corner of his eye. Purple is good? The paramedic asked. A slow nod and a growing smile from the knight confirmed it before his words did. Purple is good, Voodoo responded, locking eyes with Liam for a moment before going back to the terminal and mashing the keys sporadically. Finally, Voodoo pushed himself away from the computer, finished with whatever task he was performing. Hildy, you are free to use 2% of the remaining samples for large-scale physical trials of the treatment plan. You can begin now. There was an affirmative tune from the computer, and then the sounds of mechanical whirring filled the room, but much louder than they had been in the individual test chamber. Liam's eyes were pulled to a prominent, floor-to-ceiling window on the other side of the room. Looking through it, he realized that it let him look down into an expansive room filled from top to bottom with clear test chambers, just like the single one that was in their lab. Conveyor belts and pipes moved blue fluid, syringes, samples, and testing probes to the chambers. Wow, I didn't know our facility was this sophisticated, Liam admitted, watching the machines do their work. He couldn't even count how many there were, though he was sure Hildy could have given him the quantity with perfect accuracy. It's got a much higher volume of test chambers than most Capital Fleet biohazard labs, that's for sure. Voodoo concurred with the paramedic, before clasping him on the shoulder and nodding back towards the exit of the lab. Unfortunately, we can't stand here and ogle the wonders of modern biomedical automation. I've got some friends coming that I want you to meet. Liam looked up at the night quizzically. Friends? He asked, growing slightly tired with the night's opacity in communication. He'd have no relief from it yet, as Voodoo simply nodded in response. Come on, they'll be meeting us at the entrance. Liam took another look at the stream of data running across the bank of monitors as Hildy orchestrated the tests, then a glance back down at the rapidly moving armatures of the test chamber below. Without another word, he followed the knight back towards the entrance through the twisting halls of New Valois' infectious disease lab. This concludes our Royal Mirror audio story for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If there's an additional part to the story, it should appear in the description below when it is available. I'd like to take this time to thank all of the creators of the open source content used in this video, the ultimate creator, without whom any further creation would be impossible, and of course you, the viewer, for listening to it. Until we meet again, goodbye.